Hello, I'm Camilla Gilmore and I'm Professor of Mathematical Cognition at Loughborough University. And this is the second of two videos that's considering the role of executive function skills in mathematical thinking. And this video focuses on working memory. So in the video, I'll begin by providing some context, and then I'll introduce what executive function skills are. I'll then have a look at working memory in particular and think about two different perspectives we might take on working memory, and then think about what this might mean for the classroom, and finish up with some take-home messages. So first of all, I just wanted to give a bit of context. So research on executive functions falls within the broader field of cognitive science research. And I think it's probably helpful to give a definition of this field of research. So Stanford describes cognitive science as the interdisciplinary study of mind and intelligence, and notes that it embraces philosophy, psychology, artificial intelligence, neuroscience, linguistics, and anthropology. And this is quite a broad definition and might be broader than the way some of you have thought about cognitive science research in the past. And there has been quite a lot of focus recently on ideas from cognitive science and how they could apply to education practice. But I think that this is only a small proportion of the potentially relevant research. So if we think of the whole of cognitive science research as being this big circle, I think the bit that's broken through to be applied to education is actually only a very small proportion of it. So whatever your views of cognitive science research, please do keep in mind that it's actually quite a broad field. And so taking account of cognitive science research doesn't have to be reductive. There is a way of taking into account this research, but also keeping a broad view of what learning and education is. And finally, I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that what I'm presenting in this video is actually just my perspective and it's my interpretation of the research. And this is always the case when people talk about research, but often that's not acknowledged. Research and the implications of it is very rarely objective, and so you are usually hearing people's subjective views, even if it may not always be presented in that way. Okay, so having said that, let's move on to executive function skills and what they are. So executive function skills are the skills that we use to monitor and control our thoughts and actions. We use them whenever we need to respond flexibly to our environment or to engage in deliberate, goal-directed thought and action. And there's a number of different theoretical models of executive function skills. The one that I'm going to base this video on is a model presented by Miyake and colleagues. And this has three different components: working memory, inhibition, and shifting. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to focus on working memory. And in an earlier video, I talked about inhibition. So just for completeness, I'll spend a moment or two mentioning what shifting is before moving on to working memory. And I think it's important to note that although the Miyake model has these as three separate components, in early childhood, these are often not very easily differentiated, and it might be more helpful to think of executive function skills more holistically and how they work together to have an impact on children's learning and behaviour. So shifting. This is also often referred to as cognitive flexibility or task switching. And this is involved whenever we need to switch our mental focus between different tasks, and especially if we do this in the face of distraction. It's also required whenever we need to consider multiple different perspectives of a situation at the same time. And these are obviously activities that we may often need when we're doing or learning mathematics. And so it's not that surprising that research has found that shifting skills are associated with mathematics achievement. So individual differences in measures of shifting are correlated with individual differences in mathematics achievement measures. However, at the moment, this research is at quite an early stage, and there are some issues with it. So it's often difficult to really precisely pinpoint the relationship between shifting skills and mathematics. So we don't always see a specific relationship with shifting if we're also in the same analysis already taking account of working memory or inhibition, for example. And there are also notable challenges in this research, particularly around the measurement of shifting skills. So this is especially the case for younger children. So the kinds of tasks that we use to measure shifting will also typically also require working memory and inhibition, and therefore it can be quite difficult to isolate and accurately measure shifting. But I do think this is an area that deserves more attention, and hopefully we will understand this better in the future, because it does feel as though this is something that might be particularly important for mathematics. Okay, so now turning to working memory, and this is an idea that's likely to be familiar to many people. So working memory is involved whenever we need to hold and manipulate, which means we might change or update information in mind. And at a broad level, research suggests that up to 25% of the variance in mathematics achievement scores can be explained by differences in working memory, and particularly differences in working memory capacity. Also that children with particular mathematical difficulties may often have limited working memory capacity. So in the rest of the video, I'll unpick why we might see this relationship between working memory capacity and mathematics, and think about what particular role working memory might play. But first of all, I wanted to highlight two reasons why I think that educators should care about working memory, and it's a relevant idea for them. And sometimes I think these particular aspects are perhaps overlooked in some of the discussions. So, and first of all, it's to do with the developmental course of working memory. So working memory capacity develops substantially throughout childhood and adolescence. So this graph shows data from a large study which looked at the working memory capacity of children of different ages between age 3 and age 15. And this graph shows the average performance on the working memory measures at the different ages. And as you can see, there's a really quite substantial development in working memory capacity across this age range. And particularly in younger childhood, there's really quite a rapid development in working memory capacity. It's also worth noting that development doesn't finish mid-adolescence, but actually continues through to late adolescence or early adulthood, where working memory capacity may still be developing. And the second reason is just as important. So as well as this really substantial change in working memory capacity over development, we also see really wide individual differences in working memory capacity within an age group. So this graph shows working memory capacity for children of different ages, or working memory scores for children of different ages. And I'll talk you through the graph because there's a lot of information here. So the marker for each age group is the mean working memory score for children of that ages. And the error bars show the 10th and the 90th centile. So we can see that there's really quite a wide variation in scores for children of the same age group. And if we particularly focus, for example, on the 7-year-olds here, we can see that the children who had the lowest 10% of scores for amongst the 7-year-olds, their working memory scores were about equivalent to an average 4-year-old. Whereas the children who are at the top 10% of scores for the 7-year-olds, they actually had scores that were approximately the level of an average adolescent. And so we can see there's this huge variation. And so there's likely to be substantial differences within a class in terms of children's working memory capacity and how well they can use their working memory in the activities they're doing. And so this is going to have implications for their learning and for how they engage in mathematical activities. So whatever age group you're working with, it's really important to bear in mind that there might be this really substantial variation in their working memory capacity. Okay, so when might we need working memory when we're doing mathematics? Well, the answer is all the time for lots of different types of activities. Essentially, whenever we have to hold or change information in mind. So this will include things like remembering our goal, remembering what we're trying to achieve, building a mental model of a problem and working out what we need to do to solve it. Any type of procedural strategy that we're following, so keeping track of counting steps when counting, or keeping track of where we are in solving, carrying out a procedure. Doing mental arithmetic is particularly heavy load on working memory, and especially when we're using derived fact or decomposition strategies. Also, if we're trying to just think about the range of next possible steps that we need to take and choosing a particular strategy to follow. Also things like identifying conceptual relationships and learning and retrieving number facts. So it's important to bear in mind that working memory is not just involved when we're doing things that we might think of as memorising, but also in all sorts of higher level thinking. And so these examples show that it's not surprising that individual differences in working memory capacity can have a really pervasive impact on children's learning. So, given that, what role does working memory actually play when we do these types of activities? Now, to think about this, I'm going to present two different alternative theoretical models of working memory that might help to demonstrate the different roles that working memory plays. Now, don't worry about the precise details of the models. I just want to give you an overview of the different ways that people think about working memory. So the first model is what I'm calling the separate store metaphor. So this is probably the best known model of working memory, at least in the UK. And this comes from the original theoretical work from Baddeley and Hitch. And this way of presenting the model comes from Willingham. Now, with this model, information comes from the environment. So that's anything that we see or hear. And this is held within our limited capacity working memory. To keep information in working memory, we need to keep refreshing it or attending to it. And we can hold both verbal and visual information in working memory, and we might think of these as being somewhat separate stores. So while the information is in working memory, we need to keep refreshing it or attending to it. But if we want to keep information for longer, then we need to encode it to long-term memory. And also note that whenever we want to connect new and old information, this happens in working memory. So we need to bring the information that we already have from long-term memory into working memory in order to combine it with new learning. Okay, so that's a model that you might be familiar with, and then perhaps one that you might be less familiar with. And this is what I'm calling the spotlight metaphor. And this is an alternative theoretical model that's provided by Cowan. And here, working memory isn't seen as being a separate store of information, but rather it's the part of our long-term storage that we're currently focusing our attention on. So information comes from the environment, it goes to our long-term store, and then we can pay attention to a small part of this at a time. And here we can think of working memory capacity as being equivalent to the size of this spotlight of attention. So their focus of attention might be bigger or smaller for different individuals. So why am I showing you these two models? Well, for three different reasons. First of all, I want to show you that there are different theoretical models, that actually we don't have a really fixed view of what working memory is. And also to emphasise that these kinds of models, like all cognitive models, are actually just metaphors of what's going on. They don't map on directly to things that are happening in the brain. They're metaphors for how we process information. Secondly, I think looking at the two different models is helpful in terms of highlighting the importance of attention. And I think in the Cowan's model particularly, it really draws attention to the fact that attention is really important in working memory, because the bit of working memory is the bit of our long-term store that we're currently able to pay attention to. And finally, to highlight the link to long-term memory. So for both of the models, working memory has this really important role in connecting information from the environment to our long-term memory. So you might be thinking, oh, hang on, I thought this video was about working memory. Why are we now looking at long-term memory? What has long-term memory got to do with it? And I know that for some people, a focus on long-term memory doesn't sit well with their view of learning. And if we look at statements such as this one around learning being a change in long-term memory, I know that this can be problematic. And I actually agree that this is very problematic if we have a limited view of what long-term memory is. But actually, long-term memory is very broad, and it isn't just a list of facts, and it isn't just about memorization. There's a big difference between thinking about memory and thinking about memorization. So long-term memory is not just about memorization. So in fact, if we draw on what I indicated earlier as this sort of broader cognitive science research beyond what is often discussed within education, we can see the breadth of long-term memory. So it in fact includes all of our stored memories, our knowledge, and our skills. There are lots of different taxonomies that have been suggested, but broadly we can consider that it includes a whole range of different things. So this might be autobiographical memory. So this is our memories for events and people and activities and things that have happened in our lives. Long-term memory also incorporates perceptual memory or visual knowledge that we have. It includes language and meaning, concepts, semantics, and it also includes things like procedural memory, habits and motor skills. It does also include declarative knowledge, and this is knowledge or our memory of things that we know. And this is the bit of long-term memory that is often focused on in relation to learning. But actually, long-term memory incorporates all these different aspects of our experiences and our lives. And it's not just the declarative knowledge that the bit is that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about the role of long-term memory. And also just focusing on declarative knowledge for a moment, sometimes we might think about this as being a list of facts, but actually that's not what declarative knowledge is. It's more like a network of associations. And I go into a bit more detail of this in the accompanying video on inhibition when I look at number fact knowledge and how this might be stored. So the reason for going on that deviation is to kind of open up the idea of what long-term memory might be, and to emphasise that one reason why working memory is really important is that it's the link between our new experiences and our prior understanding and experiences. And because of this, and in fact, working memory can impact on our learning and achievement because of two different reasons. So it can have an impact because limits in working memory capacity mean that our thinking space is limited, but also it can have an impact because working memory is how we access long-term memory. And so I'll consider each of these in turn now and think about what the implications might be for practice. So first of all, thinking about the limits of working memory capacity, one consequence of this is that we can end up in a situation where children have an overload of working memory because their capacity is not big enough for the amount of information that we're asking them to focus on. And the second implication in relation to this link to long-term memory is that we can think about this role of working memory and build on this with a way of thinking that I'm going to introduce called the engage, build and consolidate cycle. So first of all, thinking about working memory overload. So what is working memory overload? Well, this happens whenever we can't hold everything in mind that we need to achieve a particular task. So I'll give a few examples of what I mean by this. So first of all, thinking about one in relation to younger children, and younger children have a particularly limited capacity, as I showed in the graphs earlier. And so even sort of seemingly simple procedures may exceed this. So one example is what's required when we're asking children to count on or use a counting on strategy. So whenever children want to do this, or we're trying to help children to do this, for example, if we want them to start at 5 and count on 3, what do they need to do? Well, they need to hold in mind the starting number, and they need to hold in mind how many counts they need to make. Then each time they count on, they need to update what number they're currently on, and also update how many they've counted on, while at the same time not forgetting how many more they need to count on. So you can see that even something that might seem like a simple task requires quite a lot of information to be held and updated in working memory. And so for young children, this can easily overload working memory capacity. Another example might relate to number fact retrieval and things like the current emphasis on times tables. So we might have a situation where children are problem solving and we've got them doing an activity using a balance beam, and we want them to pay attention to the relationships between distance and weight and balancing these. But if every time they add something to the balance beam, then they're going to have to calculate the impact of this. Then they're going to use up their working memory capacity on the calculations themselves. And that means they haven't got the capacity to then focus on these broader relationships and concepts, or to think about different strategies that they might be wanting to achieve. Whereas if they're able to retrieve the number facts, then this can help to free up working memory capacity because they're not having to use that to do the calculations. And then finally, an example from some of our research that we've done at Loughborough. And this is looking at the way that we name numbers. And across different languages, the way that we name numbers can either be helpful or unhelpful in terms of reducing the load on working memory. So English is kind of in the middle here, so that it's helpful in some ways and unhelpful in other ways. So one way it's helpful is that in English we name the decades first and then the units, so like 28. But in some other languages, such as Dutch, this is reversed, and in fact the unit is named first and then the decade. So it might say the equivalent of like 8 and 20. And what we found is that this increases the load on working memory when children do some activities, such as estimating, because they're having to hold the unit in mind before they can focus on the decade, which might be more helpful and more important when making estimations. So these are just a few examples to give you an idea of what this is about. But actually working memory overload can happen whenever we're trying to hold in mind or pay attention to too much information beyond our own individual capacity. So how do we prevent working memory overload? Well, one part of it is just realising how complex even seemingly simple things may be, and to remember or bear in mind how many different things children might be needing to pay attention to, or might be needing to update or focus on when they're doing any kinds of activities. Another really important one is about providing external support where appropriate. So in some of those examples I gave earlier, it would have been really easy to reduce this working memory overload by allowing children to use things like counters or their fingers, a number line, a number tracker, a multiplication grid that allows them to sort of offload some of this information, so they're not having to hold it all in mind themselves, but actually they can use counters or number lines and things to provide that external support. And the final thing is about being patient. So this is both in terms of giving children time to do activities, so not rushing them, allowing them the time to work out what they're doing, to use these kinds of external supports, but also just being patient with our expectations of what children can achieve at different ages, and remembering that when they're young they may have very limited working memory capacity, but also at all ages there will be a big variation in children's working memory capacity. So moving on to the second implication of working memory, and this is the link between working memory and longer term learning and memory. So I highlighted earlier how working memory is this link between our new experiences and our prior understanding and experiences. And the engage, build, consolidate cycle is a way to take advantage of this to support learning. And you can find out some more information about this online. So I'll just give you a headline about it today. So first of all, in this cycle, we need to engage children's focus and attention on what they're learning. And engagement may be linked to reward. And there's a really broad research literature around reward and engagement. But broadly speaking, this can be driven by either intrinsic or extrinsic rewards. And there are lots of different drivers here, and we may differ in what is most engaging for us. So for some it might be achievement, for others it might be novelty, for others it might be interest. It's important also to note that anxiety can interfere with this and can get in the way of engagement with activities. So secondly, and then really importantly, we need to build on this engagement. And to build new knowledge, we must actively focus on this. So this means paying attention to it in working memory. So if we think about those two different models I introduced earlier, in order to, within the separate storage model, you have to keep paying attention and refreshing information in working memory to keep it actively in there. And in the spotlight model, we need to pay attention to what in our long-term store that we're trying to focus on and to allow us to connect it up with our existing information. And so building meaning comes from making these connections to existing knowledge, understanding, or experiences. And then finally, we need to consolidate learning so it's available in the future. And this can be done in a range of different ways, but essentially what we need to do is practice or rehearse new knowledge to make it more secure. And while we're doing this, it also frees up our attention for other activities and to focus on other information and for new learning. And this can be done in a number of different ways. So it can be done by applying the new knowledge, by linking it with other existing knowledge, or by practicing retrieving it. So retrieval practice does have a role to play here, but it isn't the only option when we're thinking about consolidating learning. So to summarise, executive function demands are integral to mathematical thinking, and they're involved in everything that we do when we're learning and we're practicing mathematics. In particular, we might want to be aware of working memory demands of activities. So we can't remove working memory demands, and it wouldn't be appropriate to do that, to remove them completely. But we might want to think about not overloading children unnecessarily and allowing them to have the supports that they need to help them not be limited by their working memory capacity. And we also need to consider the developmental appropriateness of what we ask, particularly of the youngest children who might have very limited executive function skills, while also bearing in mind that there'll be variability at every different age. So thank you for listening.